They are the A-Team, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, the Adams Family. They are one of the most powerful criminal organisations in the UK. While ruling London's underworld and controlling the inflow of narcotics with iron and fist, the crime family raked in a bucket load of money, as much as £200 million at one point. Violence, narcotics, money laundering, fraud, robberies, eliminations, every possible crime was on their rap sheet. And yet, they managed to escape the dark, narrow prison walls. What did they do to accomplish it? How did they become one of Britain's most notorious crime syndicates? Join us to explore the story of a crime family that could have inspired the famous show Gangs of London. It's the story of the Adams family. You must be tired of hearing the name Kray Twins every time a gang's notoriety is being discussed, but this gang was termed as worse than the Krays by a police officer, not us. Now that we've talked about the Kray Twins so much, would you like a special episode on the rise and fall of these notorious brutes? While we keenly await your answer, let's dive into the chilling saga of the Adams family. Who was the Adams family? Formed by Terry, Tommy and Patsy Adams in the 1980s, the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate were involved in narcotic trafficking. Very much like the Wallaces in the Gangs of London TV show, they thrived on violence while raking in boatloads of money on narcotics and extortion. At their peak, their empire was worth £200 million. However, wealth wasn't the only source of their notoriety. They were infamous for their ruthlessness, violence and eliminations. The gang was linked to various hitmen, including one famous jigsaw executor, Stephen Marshall. Born to Irish parents with 8 other children, the Adams brothers lived in their family home in Barnsbury, Islington. Their father was a Northern Irish Catholic lorry driver, and they were raised in the then deprived corner of Islington. They started their criminal career from armed robberies in the 1970s. As the police squads got better at tracking down armed robbers and the cash in transit diminished, paving way for electronic money transfers, the thugs found a new, more profitable trade, i.e. narcotic trafficking. The demand for coke and cannabis, as well as ecstasy, had increased multifold during this time. Before that, the trade was limited to amateur and part-time criminals. With the growing demand, the ruthless career criminals took over the area. The trade boomed, fueled by violence and intimidation. Coming back to the Adams, they soon expanded their operations to narcotic trafficking, recognising the opportunity. After making money hand over fist, they needed to put it to better use, which meant there had to be new ways of money laundering. The new money laundering operation led to the engagement of corrupt financiers, accountants, lawyers and other professionals to help them wash their cash into a squeaky clean white and then invested in property and other legitimate businesses. Eventually, the syndicate's diverse portfolio ended up including illicit trade, racketeering, extortion, money laundering, bookmaking, smuggling, hijacking gold bullion shipments, security fraud, weapon trafficking and money laundering. All of these activities brought them to considerable fortune. At its peak, the Adams Syndicate had garnered a whopping £200 million. While they had a diverse portfolio, eliminations seemed to be the A-Team's speciality, as they were linked to 25 gangland eliminations. They had turned killings into an art form. From using the mafia assassination technique of assailants riding pillion on motorbikes, to dedicating Afro-Caribbean muscle as an additional manpower to take out informants and rival criminals, they seemed to have covered all the bases. The brothers took pride in opening up their rivals like a bag of crisps, referring to brutal violence they used. The gang's tentacles stretched far away. They were alleged to have connections in metropolitan police officers and influence over a British Conservative MP, according to a blog named Hive. In the 80s, a rival Irish family came, the Rileys, found out about their egregious violence tactics in a bad way. Patsy Adams walked into a pub with a companion and insulted George Riley in front of his wife. Obviously, a response was to come as the other side was no civilian. Riley rushed home to get a gun and returned with several brothers in a BMW. The Adams were ready and waiting. Wasting no time, they ambushed the Riley group and sprayed the car with their weapons. There were no casualties, but the Rileys realised that the Adams clan were not to be trifled. Over time, the family was so feared that they franchised out the Adams name. The lesser criminals were able to enjoy influence by claiming they were working with or for the Adams family. The Adams brothers had multiple brushes with the law in their early years. For example, Patsy Adams was sentenced in the 1970s for armed robbery. He spent 7 years in prison for armed robbery and was released in 1975. After that, he opened up a string of businesses, but being an outlaw was his major role. In the 1980s, he was jailed for possessing firearms and ammunition. They kept their Clerkenwell-based syndicate strictly family and close friends. Up until the 90s, they remained untouchable. They seemed immune from the law, despite various efforts and inquiries conducted by Scotland Yard, HM Customs and Excise, and the Inland Revenue. No matter how much the authorities tried, cases against the gang either didn't pick up or collapsed. The details of such cases are coming in the latter part of the video. The brothers didn't have any bank account or tax records. Even the houses they lived in weren't under their names directly. However, their influence started diminishing from 2000s onwards. In 1998, Tommy Adams was convicted of orchestrating an £8 million hash smuggling operation. Here is what Terry had to say about his arrest. We were able to know because he was still being recorded by MI5.
He's got caught. Terry is apoplectic.
If you get a so-called brother saying he represents the family behind our back, he's trying to get us all done. He deserves it all, worse than a drug. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to smash him in the face with an iron bar.
What are you, mate? You're mad.
I'm the cunt, and I'm going to have him. Dan, I've got something about me when things happen. When I hit someone with something, I do less damage.
Nevertheless, Tommy was sentenced to 7 years. The judge asked him to either surrender some of his profits or face an additional 5 years. Tommy's wife turned up twice in the court with a briefcase full of cash. Why was the A-team untouchable? Despite the Adams family's brushes with the law, they managed to stay out of jail for a better part of their criminal career, all thanks to their far-reaching connections. The crime family was known to use corrupt police officials to hinder investigations. In 1999, a Crown Prosecution Service clerk called Mark Herbert was jailed for involvement in passing details of 33 secret police informants to the Clerkenwell gang. Moreover, whenever Terry and his cohorts faced prosecution, they managed to come out unscathed. Either the trials would collapse due to witness intimidation or end in acquittals. One of the most famous examples in this regard is the gruesome story of David Mackenzie, a Mayfair financier who laundered narcotic money for the Adams family. Unfortunately for him, he lost around £1.5 million in the late 1990s after a series of poor investments. He was summoned to Terry's home and told to pay back the money. However, the cash wasn't forthcoming. This led to the beginning of Mackenzie's tragedy. A few days later, he was savagely beaten by an Adams associate, Christopher McCormack. The attack continued for a whole 20 minutes, after which the man ended up with 3 broken ribs, slashes around the wrists and face. The attack involved a Stanley knife. We'll leave the rest to your imagination, because YouTube doesn't allow us to go into further details. Nevertheless, the case went to court. DNA samples showed McCormack's involvement, as Mackenzie's blood was on his motorbike jacket. However, he claimed that it must have come from a previous incident when he'd broken up a fight between Mackenzie and another man. You'd be surprised to know what happened next. The jury agreed. Not only this, but after the verdict, McCormack thanked the jury and asked them to have a drink over at the pub with him. One elderly male juror even waved at him. The list of controversial cases goes on. In 1985, Tommy Adams was acquitted of his involvement in laundering the proceeds of the £26 million Brinks-Mat bullion robbery, while brother Patsy was cleared in the 1990s of importing 3 tons of cannabis worth £25 million. Soon after that, Patsy was again arrested for another narcotics offence. The officers also found a weapon and a set of bulletproof body armour. However, Patsy claimed they belonged to his wife, and guess what? The jury believed that too. Apart from their connections in the legal system, the syndicate was also protected by the Code of Omerta, under which career criminals refused to cooperate with the police. In 1991, there was an attempt on the life of East End thug Mad Frankie Fraser outside a Clerkenwell nightclub. Frankie was a Gangland veteran and former henchman for gangster twins Reginald and Ronnie Kray. He narrowly escaped the attack but lost part of his mouth. The shooting was linked to the Adams family, but when Fraser was asked about the orchestrator by detectives, he replied, Tutankhamun. For those of you who don't know what that means, Tutankhamun was an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. Another unsolved elimination linked to the Adams family is of British high jump champion Klaus Mosley. He worked for them as a narcotic dealer in the late 1980s. The brothers suspected him of skimming profits. Obviously, this didn't end well for Mosley. He was allegedly cut in half with a samurai sword in 1994. A family enforcer named Gilbert Winter was linked to this horrendous elimination. However, he was acquitted in the trial because the chief prosecution witness refused to give evidence. That's how much people feared them. What's more, Winter himself disappeared soon and was rumoured to have been encased in concrete under the Millennium Dome in 1998. The stories of their gruesome violence were aplenty. However, it wasn't the cause of their downfall. What brought their ruthless criminal network down was money laundering and financial crime legislation. Last brushes with the law. As is the case with any crime syndicate, the law somewhere caught up with them in the end. In 2007, Terry Adams pleaded guilty to money laundering and was slapped with a prison sentence. Although he was released in 2010, his financial legal woes continued. Well, apparently. He was living in social housing in Bloomsbury with his wife. Patsy Adams was sentenced to 9 years in 2016 for attacking an associate. Tommy Adams also fell within the grasp of the law a few years later. He was convicted of money laundering and sentenced to 7 years in 2017. Terry Adams, the syndicate's mastermind.
Terry is a businessman. He abhors limelight, publicity. He just doesn't want it. He wants to stay in the background, getting on with his business.
Terry is now the shadowy leader of what has become known as the A-Team.
Leader of the A-Team, Terry Adams was born on October the 18th, 1954 in London. He was the mastermind of the crime syndicate, having created it with his brother Thomas Tommy Sean and Patrick Patsy Daniel John. He was the eldest of the 11 siblings. He started his career by extorting money in the playground. He left school at 15 in 1969, after which he ran protection rackets involving market stallholders. Then he switched to armed robberies and soon delved into other profitable crimes. By the 1970s, his family syndicate had diverged into more lucrative narcotic trade, where they forged ties with Colombian cartels and created a network of dealers to distribute cannabis and coke and later ecstasy. All of this was possible because of Terry's business acumen. He ran the syndicate like a proper business, with corporate-style board meetings. However, this didn't stop his brothers from being ruthless thugs. Patrick was the enforcer and Tommy was the money man, but neither of them refrained from getting their hands dirty. Terry himself didn't have a clear record. He was charged with a plethora of offences, but got off in the end. Nevertheless, Terry's criminal career spanned almost 5 decades, in which he ruled London's underworld with an iron fist. Controlling a giant portion of London's illicit trade and watching over countless horrifically violent attacks, the thug stayed at the top unchallenged for years. He remained a fixture in the gangland for 20 years. Even the court hearings mentioned his style and clout. Once the court was told that everyone stood up when he walked in. Another statement was, he looked like a star, a cross between Liberace and Peter Stringfellow. He was immaculately dressed in a long black coat and white frilly shirt. He was totally in command. Terry managed to garner boatloads of money from his diverse enterprise. In the early days of his thriving family empire, he brought a £1 million home in cash and filled it with antiques and artworks, including Henry Moore prints and Picasso etchings. There was a life-size poster of Al Pacino in his role as Tony Montana in the mafia movie Scarface over the fireplace. He also owned a holiday villa in Cyprus along with a yacht. His daughter was privately educated at the Sylvia Young Theatre School. He was seen dining at the top restaurants, wearing bespoke suits and travelling in a fleet of luxury cars. This bling was bound to come to the police's notice, and it did. walls closing in on Terry. Terry finally came on the police's radar. Given the racket his gang was making on the streets, it was only a matter of time. Nevertheless, he became so notorious that a secret squad was set up by the police and MI5 to gather intelligence on him. They would listen to recordings of his calls.
Spooks, essentially, and very, very, very top of the line pieces of listening equipment were put in place.
What it was a deal for 250 grand. But they said it wasn't worth 250, but 200. Who said that? The people you know? The geezer's come in all heavy, saying that he runs Islington. Well, he's fucked.
In Terry Adams' front room, the talk is of associates who've crossed the line.
This increased surveillance caused him to take the back seat and retire from the front line in the 1990s. He remained the gang's brain, though. Still, he couldn't ward off the police officers on his case. For him, exerting violence and getting away with it was easy, but laundering his ill-gotten gains and hiding it from the authorities was harder. In 1995, the Inland Revenue finally realised that the thug hadn't paid income tax at all despite his luxurious lifestyle. However, Terry did attempt to hide his nefarious income sources, but performed a bad job doing it. Solly Nahome, the Hatton Garden jeweller, helped the gang hide its proceeds. He created a set of false accounts to show that Terry worked as a jewellery designer. The income tax case was settled via the payment of £95,000, but it made the authorities suspicious. It still might not have brought the trouble for the thug had Nahome not been assassinated by a rival gang 3 years later. After his death, the laundering machine he created started crumbling. By this time, the police were well on Terry's case. This time, they were not alone in it. A collaboration between the National Crime Squad and MI5 led to a surveillance operation. While it was successful in bringing Terry to justice, the entire operation, including surveillance, court and prosecutions, security for prosecutors and the police, cost taxpayers over £50 million. Nevertheless, the security service had placed bugging devices in his bedroom and sitting room. The spy system proved to be a jackpot for the detectives, as it produced ample evidence of substantial criminality.
He's using the family name. He's using the family name. So, this is a new year. I won't be about this year. I want the geezer alive and done. I want him hurt, truffles back.
Once they had heard Terry talking with a friend about beating someone, he said, "When I hit someone with something, I do them damage. I went to the geezer, I went crack. On my baby's life, Dan, his kneecap came right out there, all white. Dan, all bone." Another time he was recording ordering revenge against a girl called Alicia. "She's got to be done. She's got to have acid flung in her face." That's pretty disturbing. And what's even more egregious is the casual manner he is in talking about committing this gruesome violence. The thug's extraordinary spending also came to the authorities' attention. £45,000 for a Mercedes sports car bought for daughter Sky, tens of thousands more on first-class flights. All these expenses were made by a man with no obvious source of legal income. Despite the evidence, it took years for the case to reach court. It turned out that violence and criminal activities weren't Terry's only specialisations. He knew the ins and outs of the legal system. He used cynical delaying tactics to ensure the case didn't reach court. From firing his defence teams repeatedly to claiming his IQ was too low to comprehend the charges, he used every ace up his sleeves to stay out of the woods. After dragging the case for years, he finally pled guilty to a specimen money laundering charge and was sentenced to 7 years. His plea bargain deal included dropping charges against his wife. The thug admitted conspiracy to conceal criminal property on the basis that he wasn't involved in any criminal activity to create money for the last 6 years, and he didn't earn it from narcotics trafficking. On his sentencing, a senior detective remarked, "Adams has never done an honest day's work in his life and tried every trick in the book to get off. The fact that it took nearly 4 years to reach this stage is an indictment of the criminal justice system." In the end, he had no wriggle room left, but this has come at a huge and completely unnecessary cost to the taxpayer. While he was released halfway through his sentence, his financial woes persisted. During a hearing in March 2007, Queen's Counsel remarked, "Terry Adams comes with a pedigree. As one of a family whose name has a currency all of its own in the underworld, a hallmark of his career was the ability to keep his evidential distance from any of the violence and other crime from which he undoubtedly profited. His conviction made him the subject of a financial reporting order, which is often applied to career criminals. He was required to disclose sources of all cash and possessions worth more than £500. That's how a case that would have started in 2003, had it not been for the delays, finally culminated. In 2003, detectives had found £500,000 worth of art and antiques in his house. They also recovered £59,000 in cash and jewellery worth more than £40,000. After getting sentenced in 2007, he was also ordered to cough up £4.8 million in legal fees to 3 law firms who previously represented him through the UK's free legal aid scheme. Having admitted to the offence, he was ordered a few months later to file reports of his income for the next 10 years. What do you expect would have happened? You cannot expect a dealer and money launderer, amongst others, to be honest about his earnings, especially when it's to report to the authorities. He was found in 8 breaches of his financial reporting order in 2011. He was sent back to prison in 2012 when it turned out that he didn't declare luxury purchases, including a £7,500 facelift, membership of an exclusive Hertfordshire country club, and £2,200 on a Cartier watch. In 2014 he was ordered to pay another £650,000 under the Proceeds of Crime Act, but he claimed to be penniless as he was ordered to pay another £700,000. However, the justice system wasn't having it. The prosecutors told the court that he was enjoying massages, expensive meals and first-class flights while claiming to be broke. At that time he was living in an apartment near St Albans in Hertfordshire. The case dragged on until 2017 when a district judge ordered Adams to either pay the amount or get an additional prison time of 2.5 years. It worked. As for the self-proclaimed broken man, managed to scramble £730,000 in less than 24 hours. You must be thinking that Adams must have learnt his lesson after this and refrained from tricking the justice system. But he got another thing coming. He pulled the same stunt in 2019 when he was ordered to pay £50,000 in prosecution costs owed to the Crown. Again he pleaded extreme poverty. The judge lost his patience and announced that Adam would be sent to prison if he refused to pay. The threat worked this time too, and the thug coughed up cash within 24 hours. After that, he remained as a free man. This saga will give you deja vu in the story of Tommy Adams. Just wait and watch. Interestingly, despite orchestrating violence, engaging in illicit trade and committing numerous other crimes, he was only convicted of money laundering. Even then, he got off lightly, managing to walk free by paying a hefty sum. It was reported in the same month that Adams was living with his wife in a housing association flat. Terry Adams had to repay £750,000 after his release. That's a little too much money for a man who was living in public housing flat. It's appalling to know that the local council taxpayers would have had to foot the bill for a thug's house who robbed and defrauded them for years, not to mention wreaking havoc on their streets. What's more, that public housing wasn't as meagre as it may sound to many. Terry Adams was living in a highly coveted street in the middle of Bloomsbury where local bankers, lawyers and captains of industry lived. He sure was a colourful addition to the community with his actress wife, who made an appearance in EastEnders, 999 and, quite ironically, The Bill. Notably, he was released but couldn't go back to his old life as his brothers had clocked up a series of convictions. Both Patrick and Tommy were behind bars along with Michael, also known as Mickey. He was close to joining them but secured freedom at the last moment. Tommy would do the same later. Wait till we get there. A court hearing revealed that his flat in the aforementioned area, where he'd been living for 18 months, was owned by the Labour-run borough of Camden. And just like that, a gang boss with a reputation for crushing bones, slashing faces and breaking the bank was occupying one of Britain's most coveted council houses for just £160 a week rent. The confusing part of this story is yet to come. In March 2016, before Adams got the keys to the property, Camden Council announced to remove anyone with assets exceeding £32,000 from the 27,000 strong council house waiting list. Moreover, the desiring tenants were required to prove that they had lived in the borough for at least 5 of the last 7 years. Terry Adams fulfilled neither of the requirements, and yet he got his house while thousands of more deserving and honest but less well-connected lads were left out. Was it Terry's reputation that made it hard to say no to him, or his ability to play the system, whether in staying out of jail or applying for council housing, that played a crucial role here? Tommy Adams, the fixer.
Tommy got involved with financiers or the launderers of stolen money and goods. He'd also formed links with Jamaican Yardie gangs, and so Tommy had sort of got involved in those sides of the business, and so he'd got access to large amounts of money one way or the other.
Tommy Adams was second in command of the feared syndicate. As the A-Team's influence declined after 2000, he carved out a niche from his money laundering scheme. His fixer Harold Ambos Antonadis and bookkeeper Steve Marden, who managed the Camden Cab Company, helped him organise the dirty money network. Another thug, Martin Dowd, planned a series of cash runs from Manchester to pay off his debts to Adams. Given the abundance of cash, Adams splurged on extravagant purchases, one of which included £32,000 car for his daughter Terry. Such expenses also caught the attention of the authorities. According to detectives, Adams had a ghost-like existence. He lived like a king with luxury cars, holidays and clothes without any financial footprint. Tommy was jailed in 2017 for orchestrating deliveries of dirty cash for 7 years after being found guilty of various money laundering offences. He used a taxi firm to make cash runs between London and Manchester for debt collection worth £250,000 from the crime bosses. He was arrested due to the painstaking efforts of undercover cops. A central London cafe was bugged in 2014 to record his conversations, and Tommy didn't disappoint. He raved about his criminal enterprise, giving the cops plenty of evidence. His bragging led to the prosecutors to calculate the sum he should repay. The thug was boasting to an associate about purchasing land in Limassol, Cyprus, to build a house at a knockdown price, saying, "Bit of land I bought a few months ago. It cost me no money, £110,000 of sterling. They wanted 200 first. Fella desperate. It's land, that's it. I'm going to get an architect. Draw up the plans." This recording was used to prove he had considerable assets acquired through dirty cash. The assets added up to £1.24 million, including properties in Bow in East London. The cops also caught couriers exchanging an M&S bag filled with thousands of pounds in cash at Euston Station. These bags were to be transported by a taxi firm making runs between London and Manchester. The police had already caught another gang member, Christos Nicholas, with £99,000 in 2013. Another member caught was Robert Winstanley with £10,000 cash wrapped in tin foil in 2013. During the trial, the gang's behaviour surprised many and indicated their disregard for the legal system. During the 2-month trial, they kept laughing and joking. Sometimes they even play-sparred with each other in the dock. Notably, these sentences for the gang's involvement in transfer and concealment of large sums of cash taking place in 2013 and 2014. Notably, both Tommy and Patsy's sons took after them. Tommy's son Sean fabricated a wage slip for his sister to get a mortgage. He was sentenced to 6 months suspended for 1 count of transferring criminal property, whereas Patsy's son, George Adams, had several brushes with the law for multiple offences including robbery and possession of weapons. Tommy in hot waters. While serving time for money laundering, Tommy faced another blow. He was ordered to repay £1.24 million. He had paid back £937,000 after selling his home and owed over £415,000 towards the proceeds of crime confiscated order imposed in 2020. In 2022, the crime boss was given 3 weeks to pay £400,000 or spend another 7 years behind bars. That's the deja vu we talked about earlier. The same thing happened to his brother, within only a few details changed. Tommy sold off his homes and land to pay the required amount. Patsy Adams, the brute.
Then there is Patrick, or Patsy as he's known across North London.
Patrick was always the more physical one, the one who was more imposing, and he, in the early days certainly, was the muscle of the gang. He'd be the one to go out there and do the physical confrontations.
bit of a live wire. He used to let his fists do the talking a bit too often and had to be reined in a bit, now and again by the other brothers.
The most notorious Adams brother for violence and thuggery, Patsy Adams, wreaked havoc in London for decades. However, after Nahum's elimination, he started spending more time in his Spanish villa. His downfall came with the elimination of an associate. Patrick was jailed for 9 years in 2016 for attempting to take out Paul Tiernan, who he accused of being a grass. He fled to Holland after publicly attacking the man in December 2013. This is CCTV footage of Patrick running from the scene after the attack. The noose was already tightening on his family crime syndicate. He said that he feared his family name would deprive him of a fair trial. He would get a biased trial because he was an Adams. However, he pled guilty to causing grievous bodily harm with intent. Adams' lawyers maintained that it was Tiernan who wanted to eliminate their client. He was found in possession of a passport, a knife and £900. The lawyers used this as evidence of an intended hit. However, they admitted their client employed more than reasonable force to defend himself. The court heard that the two men had been friends for the past many years but grew apart. Here is what Paul Tiernan had to say about how they become friends.
I'll be straight. I was in ones that was on E-Wing, and I was shouting out the window at someone in the block. I was arguing, and I heard a voice go, "Is that Paul Tiernan?" And I went, "Yeah, who's that?" He means Pat Adams. And you know the first thought coming to my head? Fucking hell, he knows who I am. What the fuck's that about? I was privileged.
I know what?
Yeah, he knows who I am. How can he know who I am? I went, yeah. Anyway, long story short, he got there 2 days before. Screw came in to drag him out of bed, and he attacked the Screw, and he got put in the block. And the first involvement with him was a geezer was slagging him off, or slagging his family off out the windows, a black geezer. And he went, "Paul, do us a favour." I went, "Yeah, of course." And I nearly come unstuck with the geezer because he was a right lump, and it took 2 of us to have him over at the end of it. But that's how I got to know Pat.
According to Adams, Tiernan abused Class A narcotics and anabolic steroids, which rendered his behaviour irrational and unpredictable, but the judge maintained that it was Patrick who had decided to use the weapon. Notably, Patrick's wife was also charged with attempted elimination, but the charges were dropped later. Patrick had attempted to dispose of evidence, including the weapon, and evaded arrest by fleeing to Holland, and yet all he received was 7 years in punishment. Who do you think in the story of Terry and Tommy Adams won? Authorities or criminals? After committing all the terrible crimes they committed, they managed to wriggle out of jail, and that too by using their ill-gotten gains. Who can be claimed victorious in this story? Wensley Clarkson, author of Gangland and an expert on Britain's criminal underworld, believes that at least Terry Adams considered it a victory. He will consider that, after all the efforts that the police have made to get him over the years, that he has done rather well out of this. Do you agree with Wensley Clarkson, or believe that the thugs' inability to use their dirty cash for the rest of their lives was a punishment enough?